JSON, or JavaScript Object Notation. In today's video, you're going to learn what that is, as well as some examples of working with that. And then also we're going to end on kind of a practical example of where you see this, I would say, most common in your program. So first off, what is JSON? Well, it stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It is a text-based format that is commonly used for transmitting data across the web. In other words, it is a universal way to represent data as a string. And since it is text only, it's more easily sent between computers. So JSON is used to send across the network, and it will be sent between computers. So for example, if you're on your web browser and you need to make a request to the database to get some credentials, well, you might send a request and then you might receive those credentials back as JSON, as this text-like object. In this JSON, it is easily converted within different programming languages. Like most programming languages have a way of dealing with JSON and parsing JSON and creating their own JSON. And in JavaScript especially, JSON looks very similar to JavaScript, which is why it's called JavaScript Object Notation. It looks like a JavaScript object, but there are some kind of key differences between a JavaScript object and JSON. And JSON is a little bit more limited in the values you can use within it. So JSON has different data types, and you can use strings, numbers, objects, arrays, booleans, and null. It doesn't support using dates, functions, the value of undefined. All of those aren't valid JSON, but you could use those in JavaScript. So let's look at kind of what some JSON looks like and compare it to JavaScript. So I have a object here just within JavaScript, and it has some different properties and some different values on it. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use a couple of different methods within JavaScript. And these methods are going to be on the JSON object. So JavaScript has a built-in object called JSON, capital JSON. And this allows you to more easily work with JSON within a JavaScript program. So this object here, you get it for free within the JavaScript runtime. You don't need to create this, and it's just kind of given to you for free. And on this object, you have a stringify method. And what this is going to do is it is going to create a JSON string or a JSON text based on whatever you pass into this method. So here, since I pass my example object, it is going to create a JSON object out of my object here. So you can use the JSON.stringify method to create a JSON string out of whatever you pass into this method. And similarly, JSON also has a parse method. So on this overall JSON object, I can access the .parse method, and what this is going to do is it is going to parse the JSON into a JavaScript value. So JSON.stringify, this is going to create a JSON string of whatever value I pass in, and then I can use the JSON.parse method to parse a JSON stringified object. And this allows me to work with it just like a JavaScript object. And if I console log my stringified and my parsed object here, you're going to see some key differences here between a JSON object as well as a JavaScript object. So if I run this, you're going to see, okay, my stringified object is right here, and then my JavaScript object is right below it here. And with my stringified object, you can see like it does look pretty similar to just a regular JavaScript object. There are a ton of similarities here. But one key difference you're going to notice here is that the properties of an object, they are all within double quotes. Whereas in a JavaScript object, you don't need to explicitly put the properties within double quotes. But in a JSON object, you do. Now that is one of the key differences. There's also that key difference I mentioned with the different data type support within a JSON object. And we'll cover some kind of different JSON features here in just a second. But here you can see that if you need to create a JSON value, you can use the JSON.stringify method. And then if you need to parse a JSON string, you can use JSON.parse, and that will give you just a plain old JavaScript value. Now let's look at some valid JSON here just to kind of get an idea of what it looks like. So right here, I have a constant called valid JSON. And what this is an object that if this was within a .json file, so if you are creating JSON that you are going to like return from an API or something like that, you would store it in a .json file. It wouldn't be a .js file. It would be .json. And in that file, if I had some object that looks like this would all be valid JSON. So as you can see, all the properties are within double quotes like I showed you in my example earlier, and then they just have a value next to them, similar like a JavaScript object, and it does support numbers within JSON, so I can do something like this. This value here, since JSON supports numbers, I don't need to wrap this in quotes here. Only the properties need to be wrapped in these double quotes. And then same with value of true here. This doesn't need to be wrapped in quotes, only the properties need to. So it supports numbers, booleans here, and then it also supports arrays and kind of nested objects. So here I have a property called members, and it points to an array here, and you would create an array just like a JavaScript array. This doesn't need to be within double quotes here. And then within this array, you have another object, which also has some different properties and values. And this object doesn't need to be in double quotes here either. And then it also has a nested array within the powers property. So you can see it looks very similar to a JavaScript object, but kind of the key difference here is that the properties are surrounded by double quotes. Just like I mentioned in these keynotes here, the properties are surrounded by the double quotes, and then they also only support the data types I mentioned earlier. They don't support a couple of the data types that JavaScript does. And then JSON can be a little bit finicky, meaning even a single comma or a single misplaced colon can result in invalid JSON and result in errors within your program. I literally just the other day within my professional career, I spent like a half hour trying to find a comma that was misplaced in some JSON. Now, you will get probably errors in your editor that show you like the file and the line of code in which your JSON is off. So I don't think you necessarily need to memorize all the rules when it comes to JSON commas and colons and stuff like that. Just know that it can be finicky, and if you're getting errors, you might need to just like Google search valid JSON rules and kind of go through and see where you're kind of wrong there. All right. But the kind of key differences are that all the properties must be within the double quotes here. And then JSON, it's not going to support dates, functions, and undefined. Now, let me show you an example of what this looks like or where you're going to see this often within your program. So like I said earlier, JSON is commonly used to send data across your network from computer to computer because this text-based format provides a lightweight way to send this data across your network. Now, JSON isn't the only data type format that will be used to send data across your network, but is likely the most common one that you're going to see. And often when you're working with external APIs or application programmer interfaces, which are just basically programs that you can interact with and use those programs within your own program, often those are going to return some sort of JSON data. And then when you get that within your JavaScript program, you're going to have to parse that data to then use it. So let me show you an example of this. And I highly recommend MDN, Mozilla Developer Network. They have a ton of great tutorials and examples on there of a bunch of different things. But here they have this open API at this URL to where when I hit this API here, or I hit this URL with a request, it's going to return this superheroes JSON. And then once I receive that JSON, I then need to parse that JSON. So what this is going to look like is that I have my URL here. So I'm just going to use the fetch method, and future tutorials are going to be coming on the fetch method here. But I use fetch method in which I can pass this URL. And basically this is just going to create a network request to this API here, or to this URL. And then this fetch request, it's going to return a response object. All right, so the fetch request returns a response object. And on this response object, it's going to have a .json method, which is basically going to parse the JSON that I receive. So I'm going to hit this API here, which is going to return JSON. Then my fetch method, once this resolves, is going to return a response object that has a JSON method in which I can then parse that JSON and parse this data to then use it within my program. So here on line 89 and 90, I'm going to console log my response here, which is an unparsed response containing this JSON data. And then I'm also going to console log what it looks like after I actually parse it with my response.json. So if I call this populate method here, and let me just clear my console. If I call this populate method here, you're going to see that before I call my .json method, we get this response object here. And as you can see, there's not like much we can do with this response object. So if you see something like this within your program, it's probably an indication that maybe you just forgot to parse your JSON or something like that. Now, underneath it, you can see that now, after I call my parse method, we get this nice JavaScript object here, in which I have a superheroes property, and that points to a superhero here with a hometown, a secret base, and different things like that. So the fetch method returns a response object, and since many APIs return a JSON file, this response object, it already has a built-in .json method that actually is an asynchronous method, which is why I need to await it here. That's going to parse this JSON and then allow me to use it within my programs. So when receiving JSON back from an API, one key thing to remember is that you're very likely going to need to parse that JSON before using it within your programs. So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It is a text-based format that looks a lot like JavaScript, and it is commonly used for transmitting data across the web. And since it is text only, it provides a lightweight way to send this data across the network. And a couple key differences between JavaScript and JSON are that JSON only supports the data types of strings, numbers, objects, arrays, booleans, and null. In JSON properties, all of the properties must be wrapped in double quotes. And if you just have a single comma or single colon off within your JSON, it's going to result in invalid JSON. And one of the most common areas you're going to see this JSON and work with this JSON is when receiving data from an external API, because that is commonly used to transmit this data across the network. And just remember, before you use that JSON within your program, you're likely going to need to parse it. And if you're using the fetch method, it returns a response that already has a .json method allowing you to parse this JSON. So hopefully this tutorial gives you a good idea on how JSON works and kind of where it's used in your programs. And I will see you in that next one.